Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And again, this is what I call my Morning Musings. I come to you every Friday morning at 9:30 Central Time. I appreciate you being with me, and I want to encourage you. Go to my website, donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com, and you can avail yourselves there of literally hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of articles, covering the material that I'm sharing with you here on my Morning Musings. Also, if you like YouTube, all right, go to my YouTube channel, Don K. Preston, Morning Musings. I produce YouTube videos about most of the time, 5 days a week, all right? 4 days a week, I do exegetical studies. Generally speaking, on Friday mornings, I do a review of books and materials that have been written in an attempt to refute what I am saying. Many people find those very special Friday sessions especially helpful as they respond to the detractors. They respond to the objectors. And so please avail yourselves, number one, of my websites. And by the way, on my websites, you're going to find a plethora, an abundance of books, DVDs, MP3s on what we call covenant eschatology. You know, N.T. Wright, one of the foremost scholars in the world right now, even though he certainly does not espouse fully the view that I take, he nonetheless says in one of his books, if anyone wants the citation, just contact me. I'll be glad to give it to you. But N.T. Wright says that covenant eschatology is found on the pages of many Bible books. Now, what is covenant eschatology? Well, in the proper, correct, and full definition, covenant eschatology is what I've been sharing with you here on Morning Musings on Now TV for the last several months. It is the view that the Bible is not concerned about historical eschatology. In other words, it's not concerned with, nor does it predict, the end of human history. That's historical eschatology. Covenant eschatology, what I share with you here on the Now TV network every Friday morning, 9:30 Central Time, is the view that when the Bible talks about the coming of the Lord, the judgment and the resurrection, when it talks about the end of the age, it's not talking about the end of the current Christian age. It is not talking about the end of time. It is talking about, rather, the end of the old covenant age of Israel that occurred at the time of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. That is the time foretold by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24, in which he came on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. The visible events of the fall of Jerusalem demonstrated and manifested that Jesus is King of Kings, Lord of Lords, that he was coming in the glory of the Father, which, as I have shared with you in many earlier videos, means, as he said in Matthew 16, 27 and 28, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels, shall reward every man according to his works. And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So, here is Jesus' prediction that he was going to come with the angels in the lifetime of that first century generation. In predicting the fall of Jerusalem, he spoke of that as his coming on the clouds with power and great glory to manifest that he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And again, be sure to go back and watch the previous videos, okay? There you will find the full vindication from the Tanakh, the Old Testament, demonstrating and defining that the day of the Lord was never intended to be understood as a time when a physical man coming out of heaven, on a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body, would come out of heaven on a cumulus cloud. That was never the idea of the day of the Lord. So again, I hope that you will avail yourselves of the vast amount of literature that is available to you absolutely free of charge. I hope that you will avail yourself of some of the books, the DVDs, the MP3 studies. We have them available in download form. We have books for those of you who are overseas. We have books in PDF form at a greatly reduced price. So there's a wealth of information available to you. And oh, by the way, be sure to watch William Bell on Saturday afternoons right here on Now TV. Be sure to check the listings. You'll find that William Bell, fantastic Bible teacher, a fantastic scholar. Dr. Bell will help you to understand what covenant eschatology is all about, just like I strive on this program to help you understand what biblical eschatology is all about. Okay, I have been sharing with you how the challenge of Jesus is used against Christianity, against Christ, against the Bible. Jesus said unequivocally he was coming back in the lifetime of the first century generation. Now, the atheists, the skeptics, the Jews, the Muslims, they all tell us he failed. That means he lied. That means he's not the Son of God. I have asked you repeatedly, how do you answer the challenge of Christ? He said himself, if I do not do the works which the Father has given me, do not believe me. Do not believe me for my words' sake. Believe me for my works. So the challenge to you, the challenge to me, is to be able to demonstrate that Jesus kept his word. That he actually came. Again, I've shared with you from the Old Testament, I've shared with you from the New Testament, that this language of the coming of the Lord on the clouds of heaven with a shout, with the sound of a trumpet, was never ever intended to be taken literally. Well, many people, as I've shared with you over the last several videos, they appeal to the Transfiguration and they say, well, you see, when Jesus said he was coming back in that generation, that refers to the Transfiguration just 6 days later. But I've been sharing with you from 2 Peter that Peter looked at the Transfiguration as a vision of the second coming. And Jesus did not tell his apostles, he did not tell that large multitude that was present with him that day, he did not tell them, some of you standing here, now remember, that's out of a large multitude, according to Mark chapter 8. Jesus did not say, some of you standing here will live for 6 more days. You see, it makes no sense whatsoever. So when Peter, in 2 Peter, tells us that he saw on the mountain, on the Mount of Transfiguration, he saw a vision of the second coming of Christ, of the parousia of Christ. And that what they saw on the mount answers the skeptics. It answers the scoffers who, in 2 Peter chapter 3, were saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were since the beginning of creation. So Peter appeals to the Transfiguration as proof positive of the parousia, the coming of the Lord. Well, I've shared with you over the last couple of videos that Peter said, this second epistle I've written, I am writing unto you, brethren, in both of which to stir up your holy minds by way of remembrance, that you would be mindful of that which the holy prophets have spoken before. Over the last couple of videos, I've shared with you what the Old Testament prophets said about the time of the parousia, the time of the end. And I've shared with you from Jesus, from Paul, from Peter, that they affirmed without any equivocation whatsoever that the first century saints were living in the time foretold by the Old Testament prophets. Folks, I'm telling you, just got to catch the power of that. I mean, we keep hearing, we keep reading, we keep seeing on TV, one prophecy pundit after another. We're living in the last days. This is it. This is the generation. Wait a minute, folks. Wait a minute. The New Testament writers said 2,000 years ago that they were living in the last days. They said 2,000 years ago that they were living in the time foretold by the Old Testament prophets. They said 2,000 years ago that the end was near. Look at 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 5 to 17. Christ was ready 2,000 years ago to judge the living and the dead. The end of all things has drawn near. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7. The time, literally the divinely appointed time, for the judgment has come. How much more emphatic, how much more explicit, how much more powerful could language be? Now, either the apostles were correct in their affirmation that they were living in the time foretold by the Old Testament prophets, that they were witnessing what the Old Testament prophets said should happen in the last days, and that the end of the age was near, Christ's coming was near, the judgment was near. They were either right when they said it, or the prophecy pundits are correct. But if the prophecy pundits are correct, then the biblical writers are wrong. It's that simple. We have to meet the challenge of Christ. Are you prepared to meet that challenge? Oh boy, it's serious stuff. Okay, so we have been looking at 2 Peter, and what I want to do is take a very simple approach. A very simple approach to understanding 2 Peter. Now look, I wrote a book on 2 Peter chapter 3 entitled, "The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat." In that book, which by the way is one of the very few, in fact, I'm not aware of another full-length commentary on 2 Peter 3. David Chilton set out years ago to write a full-length commentary on 2 Peter chapter 3. Unfortunately, he passed away before he could complete it. He and I corresponded a great deal back and forth on it. And after reading my book, he actually said, well, I don't think I need to write a book. You've said everything that needs to be said. No, he would have added a tremendous amount, I'm confident. But I wrote this book on 2 Peter chapter 3. It is almost 300 pages long. I go into great detail into the linguistics of 2 Peter chapter 3, into the Old Testament source of 2 Peter chapter 3. I examine in depth what Jesus had to say about the passing of heaven and earth, positing it at the time of the fulfillment of all Old Covenant prophecy and the passing of the Old Covenant. So, go to my website, donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com. If you're out of the continental U.S., send me an email and say, Don, I'd really like to have a copy of your book on the elements shall melt with fervent heat, but shipping out of the U.S. would be just too much. I can't do it. What about a PDF? I can sell you the PDF at greatly reduced price, almost half price. And so contact me through my website. Be sure to mention that you saw the offer on Now TV. All right? So in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter discusses the day of the Lord. I mean, no one denies that. 99% of Christianity, there have been some magnificent, notable exceptions down through time. But 99% of the commentators say, well, it's more than obvious that Peter is predicting the end of time. After all, he discusses the earth and the elements therein shall be burned up. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. Well, everybody knows what the elements are, don't they? All you got to do is look at the elemental table. Well, you see, when Peter wrote, they didn't have the elemental table. And when Peter wrote, the elements did not mean what they mean today. I have shared with you in earlier videos how important it is to be able to look at the original text, the original audience relevance. What did the text mean to the very first audience? Not imposing our modern cosmology onto ancient text. That is a gross abuse of exegesis. It is a gross abuse of hermeneutic. What did it mean to the original audience? Well, guess what? As we will see in upcoming videos, when the first century reader read about elements, they did not think about, iron, steel, oxygen, nitrogen. No. They didn't think of those things, as I will share with you in upcoming videos. But here's the approach that I want to take to make this as simple as possible for us today. Now remember, my premise is that Jesus, exactly and precisely like he said, he was going to come in the glory of the Father. As I've shared with you, that meant he was going to come like the Father had come many times. Once again, go back, look at those videos. Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3 is predicting the day of the Lord. Now here's something that is so critical. Point number one, Peter is reminding them of what the Old Testament prophets said. We've already gone over that. We won't rehash that, but it's critical to remember it. Peter's doctrine of the day of the Lord in 2 Peter 3 is taken from the Old Testament prophecies of the day of the Lord. Now that means, first of all, that we ought to be able to find an Old Testament prediction of the end of physical creation, because if Peter is predicting the end of time, then since Peter said that he's only reminding us of what the Old Testament prophet said, then we ought to be able to find in the Old Testament prophecies and predictions of the end of time and the destruction of physical creation. See, that makes sense, right? That's logical. By the way, just a quick digression here. I have debated many times. And when I've debated amillennial opponents, now the amillennialist, you have to understand, the amillennialist believes that God was through with Israel at the cross. Jesus ostensibly nailed the Old Testament, the law of Moses, to the cross. Well, if God nailed the Old Testament to the cross when Jesus died on the cross, that means the Old Testament was no longer valid. I mean, after all, if it's nailed to the cross, it's dead, right? So if Jesus nailed the Old Testament to the cross, then the Old Testament was no longer valid after the cross. But if that's true, how could Peter be saying, I'm looking for, we are preaching, we are proclaiming, we are eagerly looking for the day of the Lord foretold by the Old Testament? Peter, don't you realize that the Old Testament was nailed to the cross? Don't you realize the Old Testament was fulfilled at the cross? Don't you realize the Old Testament is no longer valid at all? See the problem? Folks, listen to me. If a law or a covenant has been abrogated, annulled, stricken from the books, then you can't go to that law, which is no longer valid, and say, well, I'm still looking for the fulfillment of this. It's dead. It's gone. It's invalid. So it is the height of inconsistency when Bible commentators say on the one hand that the old law, the law of Moses, was nailed to the cross. They then turn around and tell us that Peter said he was looking for the day of the Lord foretold by the Old Testament. You see the problem? You see, this is no small problem. This is a huge problem. And it is one that we must confront, we must solve as part and parcel of the challenge of Christ. So, with that in mind, one more time, Peter said he was looking for the day of the Lord foretold by the Old Testament. Now, I want you to notice very quickly, 2 Peter chapter 3, as Peter says, and I'm just going to begin reading verse 10 for time consideration here. The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are therein will be burned up. And of course, most people say, well, see, Preston, there it is. The earth and the elements that are therein, they're going to be burned up. Well, the question, of course, is, what is the heaven and earth that Peter's talking about? We'll talk about that later. Therefore, since all of these things will be dissolved, what manner of men ought we to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening. Now look, Peter said 2,000 years ago that they were looking. Now the word that is translated as looking means eagerly looking for. They were eagerly expecting to see this day of the Lord that he's talking about. Are we supposed to believe that 2,000 years ago they were looking for the complete annihilation of the physical cosmos? Well, if they were eagerly anticipating it, they were disappointed, weren't they? We need to pay attention to Proverbs chapter 12. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. Folks, listen to me. The message of the church has the hope of the return of Christ deferred, delayed, procrastinated for 2,000 years now, even though the early church and the original apostles said there would be no delay in its coming. All right? So, looking for and hastening, the word hastening there means bringing it on, hurrying it up, all right? The coming of the day of the Lord, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for, watch it now, a new heaven and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. What does Peter say? Peter said that when he wrote 2,000 years ago, according to the Old Testament prophecies, they were looking for the new heaven and the new earth that was foretold by the Old Testament prophets. Now, folks, listen. You absolutely must catch the power of this. What kind of new heaven and a new earth did the Old Testament prophets foretell? When did the Old Testament prophets say the new heaven and the new earth would come? I want you to listen to me very, very carefully at this point. And I'm going to demonstrate this. I'm going to prove this beyond any shadow of a doubt over the next few videos. Point number one, the Old Testament prophets absolutely foretold the coming of a new heaven and new earth. Point number two, this is what you absolutely must catch. The Old Testament prophets foretold the coming of the new heaven and the new earth at the time of the destruction of old covenant Israel. Did you catch that? Let me say that again. The Old Testament prophets foretold the coming of the new heaven and the new earth, not at the time of the dissolution of material physical creation. No. The Old Testament prophets foretold the coming of the new heaven and the new earth at the time of the destruction of old covenant Israel. Boy, this changes everything. Because you see, if the Old Testament and the New, if the Old Testament teaches that the new heaven and the new earth would come at the day of the Lord, and that day of the Lord would not be an earth-burning, time-ending event, but rather it would be at the time of the destruction of old covenant Jerusalem, old covenant Judaism, then that means the following. It means amillennialists, postmillennialists, pay very careful attention. That means that if the new heaven and the new earth has not come yet, it means that old covenant Israel remains God's covenant people. I mean, after all, the new heaven and new earth doesn't come until the destruction of old covenant Israel. We'll develop this more next week. So I'll see you then.